So yeah, I make that 5 past. So yeah, welcome everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people here. I'm Dr. Deborah Russell. I'll be chairing today's event. Welcome to from the rest of the Gothic Women team who can wave at you now. Laura Kirkley, Daniel Cook, Anna Mercer, and Lauren Nixon. I'll introduce kind of the project first and then the specific event. Just before I do some kind of practical details. So yeah, today's event, we've had a fantastic response. That means it's sold out, which is just brilliant to see so many people here, but it also means that it's quite important for us to minimize pressure on the Zoom connection. So if you could keep your camera off during the papers itself, then that will hopefully keep everything going smoothly. The Gothic Women team, if the connection's okay, we'll leave our cameras on so the speakers have somebody to talk to. But for everyone else, cameras and microphones off for now. We'll have the 3 papers first and then questions for all the speakers at the end. If questions kind of occur to you as we're going along, feel free to type them in the chat. If you put a Q at the start of your question, then it means that we'll be able to spot that it is a question as opposed to general chit chat. Or you're very welcome to just hang on to your question and ask it in person at the end, turning your camera on at that point, perhaps. Yes, so yeah, those are the 2 ways of asking questions. And the other practical thing to say is please feel free to tweet about the event. Our hashtag is Gothic Women, capital G, capital W. So yeah, that's the practicalities. And then I'll just say a few words about the project as a whole before introducing this evening's event and our speakers. So the Gothic Women Project aims to celebrate the work of women writers of the Gothic, especially from the Romantic period, and especially those who have been overlooked or undervalued. So we run events like this each month, as well as hosting a blog with exciting new work on the Gothic by early career researchers and others. We have a YouTube channel and our Twitter account and our website, so do check all those out. We're supported by the British Association for Romantic Studies, so we're very grateful to them. And then tonight's event, or today's event, as we have a variety of time zones. So today's seminar focuses on Gothic bodies. And the body often functions as the locus of the fear that is central to the Gothic mode. The body can be imagined as the site of both monstrosity and suffering, pain, passion, sickness, contagion, incarceration, melancholy, and madness. These are fundamentally embodied experiences, and they really do lie at the heart of the Gothic. In focusing on the corporeal, Gothic texts can examine the operations of power on the individual, interrogating dynamics of gender, sexuality, race, disability, nationality, and class. And of course, Gothic writing also works on the reader's body, aiming, as Mary Shelley put it, to awaken thrilling horror, curdle the blood, and quicken the beatings of the heart. So that's our blurb for tonight's seminar. It's especially exciting, I think, that our 3 speakers today are going to offer talks that are going to think about Gothic bodies across different forms. We have the short story, the novel, or poetry, depending on which bits of Dacre you're focusing on, and we have the chapbook. So yeah, I just think it's a really exciting range of papers. So I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Lucy Cogan. Dr. Lucy Cogan is assistant lecturer in English literature at Maynooth University, Ireland. Her research interests include radical romanticism, women's writing in the long 18th century, and medical humanities. She's published a monograph on William Blake entitled Blake and the Failure of Prophecy. In addition, she's published a range of articles and essays on gender and sexuality in Blake's writing and on women's writing in the long 18th century. Lucy's also the co-host of the podcast The Demon Drink, which looks at Ireland's fraught relationship with alcohol through the lens of its rich literary culture. This evening's paper is drawn from Lucy's second monograph project entitled Drunkenness in 18th and 19th Century Irish Literature. This forthcoming book will be the first full-length study on the subject, tracking depictions of drunkenness in Irish literature from Jonathan Swift to Bram Stoker, alongside global trends in medical attitudes towards drunkenness. And her paper today is entitled The Female Alcoholic as Monstrous Grotesque in Mariah Edgeworth's The Lottery.
Hi everyone, just bear with me for a second as I get my screen shared. Okay, is that working? Yeah. Okay. Here we go. I should say that it should really be the female drunkard, given the period alcoholic comes in later. If there's any drink studies people here, I know they'll already be like, no. But anyway, all right. Just to say, I'm not going to argue that Mariah Edgeworth is a Gothic writer, but I am going to follow people like Tina Moran and Siobhan Kilfeather, who argue that the boundaries are not anything like as firm or fixed as some critics have taken them to be for writing in this period. Edgeworth, the arch rationalist, I'm going to argue, deploys tropes associated with the Gothic, particularly in relation to the female body, female drunkard's body, to send a message about alcohol more generally. Am I like, yeah, hang on. Okay, here we go. All right, so the text I'm going to talk about today is The Lottery, a short story from Edgeworth's collection, Popular Tales of 1804. Now, throughout her career, though, Edgeworth's writing reveals an unyielding repugnance, there we go, for those who are driven to excess due to their inability or unwillingness to regulate their bodily desires. Indeed, decades before the temperance movement emerged as a social force in Ireland or Britain in the 1830s, she was warning that overindulgence in alcohol could release ungovernable energies that posed a threat that extended far beyond the individual drinker to encompass society itself. From Edgeworth's perspective, those who abandon themselves to such behaviour place the rational self in constant danger of disintegrating into a monstrous animalistic state of impulse and appetite. Edgeworth's treatment of the negative influence of alcohol on both the individual and society combines paternalistic moralism with a diagnostic precision drawn from medical texts of the period to deliver a disturbing warning about the dangers of the subject. To this end, she displays the body of the drunk as an abject being for whom the disintegration of the self and the decomposition of the body, things that should occur at the time of death or indeed after, instead precede it. Yet by taking a clinical attitude towards this degraded condition, Edgeworth signals to the reader that the disgust we might feel has an educative purpose, allowing her to approach the abject without implicating herself in the pleasurable shock of the horror we might feel. The alcoholic exists beyond empathy, unassimilable. Her purpose is not to revel in the spectacle then, but to use the spectacle to render horrific behavior, which was, reasonably acceptable in the period. Now, the hostility towards alcohol for Edgeworth was really a family tradition. Her father also deplored alcohol and he had absorbed it from his own mother. In his memoirs, Richard Lovell Edgeworth describes how his mother was in the habit of pointing out drunks on the street or anyone who was behaving in a drunken manner for her child's edification. In The Lottery, a conscientious mother performs the same, function for her own child. But this is a lot more graphic in the text. She describes an incident when they see a man who falls down drunkenly in front of a carriage and it runs over his legs. They're broken then in a shocking manner, we're told. And she says, "See what comes of drunkenness," somewhat unnecessarily. Like her father, Edgeworth was firmly of the belief that such morality tales, if impressed upon the young mind, could dictate behaviour for life. Now, Richard Lovell Edgeworth shaped his daughter's horizons not merely through values and ideas, but also through the people she met through him. Among the connections Edgeworth prized most was her father's friendship with Erasmus Darwin, who was a founding member of the Lunar Society in Birmingham, a circle of thinkers and scientists. She was particularly interested in his work Zoonomia. Now, Cliona O'Gallagher has examined Edgeworth's response to Enlightenment thought in depth, but I think Zoonomia and this connection has not been appreciated up to now. This is a work that James Chandler describes as one of kind of Enlightenment predisciplinarity. It's very characteristic of the period. It's quite broad. And in a letter of 1796 to Darwin, Edgeworth's father notes his daughter's avid interest in this text, and particularly its terminology. He says, "She would write to ask you some questions if she dared." Edgeworth was particularly alert to the kind of anti-alcohol strain in Zoonomia. Engaging in semi-serious hyperbole, she recounts that in Zoonomia he attributes, quote, almost all the distempers of the higher classes of people to drink. This would include gout, the jaundice, and all bilious or liver complaints, in short, all the family of pain. Now, this is not inaccurate. He does indeed attribute a lot of physical problems to it, and anti-alcohol kind of campaigning was part of something quite personal for Darwin. His first wife died of alcohol abuse. But he also is in step with the period in that he sometimes prescribes people a glass or two of wine or beer for various ailments. So it seems, at least in her recollections, that Edgeworth is projecting the vehemence of her own feelings onto him when it comes to this matter. Now, the influence of Zoonomia is evident in the clinical detail. There's a Rasmus Darwin. In the clinical detail we see in Zoonomia and in the lottery, sorry. Darwin locates all diseases in a kind of disorder of the sensorium, and drunkenness for him is a disease of irritation. That is, alongside really serious complaints like arterial hemorrhage, he takes it that seriously. Aside from the direct damage it causes to the liver, the stomach, and the kidneys, Darwin also implicates alcohol via its irritative properties as an aggravating factor in many other serious disorders like epilepsy, diabetes, stroke, and psychosis. Beyond these observations regarding the physical effects of alcohol, Darwin also sketches out a prescient model of addictive behavior. Now, when it comes to Edgeworth's depiction of addiction, the figure who has probably received, that's his long section on drunkenness in the text, now the figure who has received most attention is probably the glamorous Lady Delacour in Belinda. Analysing her character, Hilary Taylor Donatini recognizes in the representation of the laudanum-dependent Lady Delacour a sharp portrayal of the addictive personality. Then, in response to Donatini, Marie McAllister suggests that Belinda is nonetheless unusual for the era in that it represents addiction as a wide-ranging class of disordered behavior that includes substance abuse, yes, but also gaming, novel reading, and even self-reinforcing belief systems. Edgeworth's familiarity with Zoonomia explains the expansiveness of her understanding of this. In Zoonomia, Darwin provides her with a model of compulsive behavior that fuses the physical and psychological harms of addiction in a manner that is analogous, if not identical, to modern understandings of the term. According to Darwin, the stimulation caused by alcohol, opium, and other forms of intense experience can induce pain or pleasure, desire or aversion, as he puts it, which may excite into action the power of volition and thus become habit forming. Elsewhere, Darwin expands on the conception of the body's responsiveness to positive and negative stimuli, outlining a theory of how such sensorial motions or bodily impulses might affect behavior. For Darwin, such impulses function like a chain of association. They can become dysfunctional and transform into something like a negative feedback loop. As Darwin explains, if a circle of actions is interrupted, as when an habitual drunkard misses a drink, the sequence will, quote, proceed confusedly till it comes to the part of the circle where it was interrupted. By conceiving of the operation of the body and the mind in terms that we would recognize as a reward system, Darwin's understanding of how disruption to that system can trigger disordered behavior closely approximates our understanding of addiction. This innovation is usually credited to people like Thomas Trotter or Benjamin Rush, but Roy Porter has said, there were quite a number of people thinking in these sorts of terms in the period. Now, one of Edgeworth's sharpest portrayal of the addictive personality appears in her minor work, The Lottery. Dated 1799, The Lottery is set in England, in Derby and in London, within a middle and upper middle class milieu. With this story, Edgeworth focuses on the impact of disordered drinking within the domestic sphere, exploring the intimate horror of what it is like to actually live with an addict. Okay, quick summary. The Lottery tells the story of an ordinary family who win a prize of £5,000. This transformed their lives, but rather than rendering them happy, the father of the house, made despondent by idleness, indulges in gaming until all the money is gone. It is undoubtedly one of Edward's lesser works. She pursues with dogged zeal the moral of the tale. Only industry and purpose can provide people with meaning and kind of a healthy life. The true interest in the story, from my perspective, is in the character of Mrs. Dolly Robinson, though, a cousin who comes to live with the family and eggs them on in all their poor choices. She is a catalyst for all the disasters that befall the family. She is a temptress, a corrupter, but not in the sexual sense. Dolly emerges as a kind of domestic monster in the tale. She is utterly undisciplined in her thought and in her conduct. She can be grouped, therefore, among those characters Kowalski-Wallace has dubbed Edgeworth's disruptive bad girls. These are women whose uncontrollable appetitive excesses, usually sexual, bring ruin upon themselves and those associated with them. Dolly's vice, though, is not sex, but brandy, cherry brandy particularly. Upon her introduction, the reader is told that she had, quote, been a laundry maid in a great family where she had learned to love gossiping and tea drinkings, and where she had acquired some taste for shawls and cherry brandy. There's a classism in here as well, of course, that she's come to ape the habits of her betters. Now, it is Dolly who pressures Morris, the father of the family, into buying the fateful lottery ticket, hounding him relentlessly until he gives in to her. When Morris resists, her first strategy is to impugn his manhood, mocking him that if he had but the spirit to lay out his money properly, he had the chance of making a fortune without any trouble. There's even an ironic suggestion that Dolly believes she has powers of prescience when she tells Morris, this is on the slide, of a dream she had 3 times over that he had bought number 339 in the lottery and that it had come up a £10,000 prize. There's a sense that Dolly is she is so kind of powerfully motivated in pushing people to do things that she can kind of will things into being almost. When Morris still resists, she resorts to tantrums, and eventually he does give in. Now, he picks 80, not 339, and he wins 5,000, not 10,000, but Dolly takes the win. She is triumphant, vindicated, and she immediately begins pestering him to spend the money on frivolous things, a coach, a fashionable house in Paddington, and so on, things that will signal the family's rise up the social ladder. Ellen, the sensible wife, instead cautions that he should invest the money wisely and open a shop. He splits the difference. He takes the house in Paddington and tries to open a shop there, and the whole thing goes wrong. Dolly, though, no longer worried about stretching her savings to cover her retirement, joins Morris in the spending frenzy. She gets into what Edgeworth calls junketing, which has nothing to do with Hollywood, but is more about making merry and celebrating. Always a querulous character, with the march of her addiction, Dolly degenerates into a state of spiteful irresponsibility, but her most destructive traits come to the fore in her interactions with George, the child of the family. At first, she just spoils him, and this seems harmless enough, but Edgeworth makes it clear that Dolly is mischievously undermining the mother's efforts to persuade him, not to be idle and not to indulge himself. The two women are presented as kind of opposite forces, pulling the family in one or the other direction. Dolly actively encourages him to give in to his appetites, stuffing him with gingerbread whenever she has the chance, like the witch from Hansel and Gretel. It is a shame that wasn't, the Brothers Grimm text didn't come out for another decade, but anyway, I'm still mentioning it. She also, though, plies him with wine, which the boy doesn't like. She says, though, down with it, George, dear, it will do you no harm, and other such things like that. Now, when George is left in Dolly's care, she abandons him to prop up a bar. And then when he comes to find her, she drunkenly tries to force a sip of punch upon him, teasing him and calling him a fool in front of everyone in the bar. It's there on the slide. But George has learned this moral repugnance of drink from his mother, Ellen. Ellen, clearly modelled on Richard Lovell, Edgeworth's paragon of a mother, prods Dolly in the gentlest manner possible to, take care of herself and consider the dangers she's exposing herself to. Dolly, though, in characteristic style, responds to this overture with wounded truculence, protesting that she drinks only for the good of her health. As a woman with no As a woman with no maternal feelings who endangers a child in her care due to her love of alcohol, we can see something in Dolly of Hogarth's monstrous mother in Gin Lane. Throughout the narrative of the lottery, Edgeworth tracks Dolly's growing dependence on alcohol with relentless precision. At first, this escalation is played for comedic effect. Dolly graduates from enjoying a large spoonful of brandy in every dish of tea to admitting she found herself uncomfortable unless she took every morning fasting a full glass of the good cordial recommended to her by her friend Mrs. Jodrell, the apothecary's wife. The narrator then interjects that this is in fact a strong dram. This exposes Dolly's petty self-deception. In Dolly, Edgeworth builds a recognizable portrait of the psychological and physical effects of addiction, which goes far beyond the brief case studies we see in Zoonomia. Indeed, in Edgeworth's account of Dolly's dysfunctional relationship with alcohol, there is a subtle critique of Darwin's own stance. Dolly understands her drinking to be therapeutic, since she has learnt that it is a remedy for everything. Besides what came out of the apothecary's shop, Mrs. Dolly found it agreed with her constantly to drink a pot of porter at dinner, at another and another at supper, and always when she had a cold, and she often had a cold, she drank large basins full of white wine whey to throw off her cold, as she said. Moderate drinking, Edgeworth makes plain, is impossible for Dolly. The medicinal framing only serves to legitimize her indulgence in a habit that is gradually sapping her of life. We're told she loses her appetite for food as her appetite for alcohol increases. Darwin lists an abhorrence for flesh food, as he says, as a particular sign of extreme and like prolonged alcohol abuse. And we see that in Dolly. So Edgeworth is still appealing to Darwin as her authority, even as she's critiquing him. Now, the darkly ironic tone of the lottery does nothing to deflect from the disturbing advance of Dolly's addiction. At last, we're told her love of drinking had increased to such a degree that she could love nothing else. In a haunting image, the narrator dispassionately relates that when she was not half intoxicated, she was in such low spirits that she sat either on the side of the bed or in her armchair wrapped in a shawl, sighing and crying and seesawing herself. This is like the circle of motions being interrupted. At other times, she is, though, messy and aggressive, drawing Ellen into quarrels with the neighbours that she can't remember when sober. This is the archetypal state of the addict, but the addict as monster. Dolly's reliance of alcohol has subsumed her entire conscious life. She's been hollowed out as a thinking subject. Over the course of the lottery, Dolly's growing and unquenchable thirst for alcohol comes to symbolize the family's loss of control over their lives, and thus by the iron law of the morality tale, her chaotic influence must be exorcised if the rest of them are to regain their previous standing amongst the ranks of the sober and useful middle classes. Yet the ending that Edgeworth meets out to Dolly is still shocking in its abrupt violence. In a state of extreme intoxication, Dolly attempts to mount her horse by climbing a gate, but, quote, the horse being pushed moved. She fell, broke her leg, and fractured her skull, unquote. Her death is reported with the clinical detachment of a medical report. Quote, the surgeon arrived, he set her leg, and during this operation, she came to her senses, but it was only the sensibility of pain. She was then trepanned, but it was all to no purpose. She died that night. Dolly is given no chance to reflect on her life, to express remorse for her choices, or to express anything else. Having already debased herself morally, emotionally, and intellectually by her drinking, at the moment of her death, she's reduced to the horror of a medical case study. She registers nothing but pain. She's there as an example for us. The death of the female drunkard produces not resolution or catharsis, but an outbreak of horror, the evacuation of the thinking self, that rational mind Edgeworth was so obsessed with. In her most incisive depiction of the dangers of alcohol in the lottery, Edgeworth fixes her authorial gaze on the alcoholic's abused embodied selfhood, lingering on the slow self-destruction it involves. This portrait, though, of Dolly completely overwhelms the rest of the tale. And even at the end, Edgeworth is forced to again reassert the true moral of the work, saying that it is indeed that money does not buy happiness that's rather been lost in all this Dolly messiness. She says, let any Mrs. Dolly in Christendom say what she will to the contrary. Even dead, Dolly will not lie quiet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. That was amazing. Yes, there's applauding hands that happening in the reactions. Yes, brilliant. So our second paper, as I was saying, we'll save questions for the end. I can see there are a couple coming in the chat there. Do feel free to kind of keep posting them. Yes, or general thanks also happening in the chat. But we'll move on to our second speaker, Laura Kreml. Laura Kreml is an assistant professor in the Humanities Department at South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. Her monograph, Romantic Medicine and the Gothic Imagination, Morbid Anatomies, will be published later this year with University of Wales Press. She also has chapters on 20th century Gothic and the medical humanities, global Gothic depictions of organ harvesting, and Gothic eco-burial in collections forthcoming in 2022. And she's also the editorial assistant for the online journal Studies in Gothic Fiction. And she'll be speaking to us today about unfeeling bones, Charlotte Dacre, melancholy, and pain management.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I have just some very simple slides. There we go. Okay. So Charlotte Dacre is perhaps best known for her scandalous novels of Floya, as well as her adoration of the infamous Matthew Lewis. Lewis is, of course, known for his violent and gory catalog of works, his literary Gothic bodies, bloody, rotting, oozing, and grotesque. Dacre emulates Lewis in much of her own literary style, and she does have her fair share of violent and sexualized bodies. But the poetry I'll be discussing today does not feature gruesome displays of blood and guts. In this presentation, which is based on a chapter in my forthcoming book, my one shameless plug, I will argue that Dacre takes an intentional step away from gore to depict bodies that are cold and empty. So today I'll be talking about Charlotte Dacre skeletons. And I'll be putting them in the context of several medical theories of the time, including melancholy, pain, and anesthesia, to argue that Dacre is telling us something about women's experience and women's pain. There are two common themes that run throughout her 1805 collection of poetry, Hours of Solitude. The first is that women protagonists have been abandoned by their lovers and are suffering medical conditions such as melancholy. The second is the cold and empty versions of death, sometimes death with a capital D, to which these protagonists are drawn. The two skeleton poems I'll be focusing on here are The Skeleton Priest, or The Marriage of Death, and Death and the Lady. As nothing but bones, skeletons are devoid of feeling, which means they're devoid of pain. My argument is that these two themes of melancholy and skeletons are directly related, and that characters are drawn to this specific embodiment of death precisely because they desire its lack of sensation. Dacre demonstrates a desire or need for pain relief at a time before the use of anesthesia as a chemically controlled form of pain relief. I argue that Dacre's poetry demonstrates a desire to legitimize women's suffering and to think creatively about the deficiency of existing methods to alleviate it. I am not claiming that Dacre predicted the use of chemical anesthesia, which would not appear for another 35 to 60 years, or that she could have known the future debates surrounding it. The term anesthesia predates the use of what we would recognize is meant by the term in the 1840s, and that is the controlled chemical loss of sensation or consciousness for the purposes of medical procedures that would be dangerously painful, like surgery. The term is found in dictionaries as early as the 1720s, however, and it is defined as a loss of or defect of sense. And this definition remains in place throughout the turn of the century. Similarly, physician William Cullen defines it in 1800 as the sense of touch impaired or lost. These definitions frame anesthesia as an unfortunate medical symptom rather than a tool to facilitate painful treatments. Thus, at this moment, notions of pain and insensibility lie at the cusp of transitions from undesirable to desirable. When I discuss anesthesia in this presentation, I refer to the earlier definition, but it is accompanied by the understanding that though the medical theory and chemistry are not yet in place, the desire or need for anesthesia for the lack of sensation may already be present. In expressing a need to relieve pain, Dacre reframes a physical defect as a palliative benefit. In other words, Dacre insists on the relevance of pain, not just as an inconvenience, but as a significant and world-destroying threat to existence. So first, I'll talk about the illness that these characters suffer from that causes their desire for these anesthetic skeletons. Adriana Creation has written about Dacre's work in the context of nymphomania, which is a medical condition theorized by D.T. Bienville in his popular 1775 text of the same name. This condition that begins with an obsession over an unattainable object triggers the fibers of the brain and turns into a sexual aggression that eventually becomes madness and self-harm if that aggression is not successful. We see this condition perfectly exhibited in Victoria of Zofloya. But I think we see something much different in the protagonists of Hours of Solitude. These characters are alone, and they are typically non-aggressive and non-violent. They more closely follow descriptions of another malady, melancholy. According to William Buchan's popular household health manual, Domestic Medicine, melancholy is characterized by the state of alienation or weakness of mind, which renders people incapable of enjoying the pleasures or performing the duties of life. This malady is shared across the women in Dacre's collection and represents a more inclusive and expansive range of women's experiences that may have resonated with readers. It is worth noting that the figures of death appear only to women in these poems. And so let's look at a few examples of what melancholy looks like in Dacre's poetry. In The Sovereignty of Love, the speaker, as one who has loved to excess, compares herself to another woman who has never loved at all. She speaks of melancholy as a bodily sensation. No fevered passion that, like mine, has burned, the even current of your blood ere turned. Listless and cool, each sober hour has passed, while mine, in feeling, various has been cast. The poem Love and Madness also describes the experience of melancholy as physical. Each nerve was fevered and convulsed her brain, it says. Buchan explains that mental and emotional afflictions like these can make the body more susceptible to other diseases and can make those diseases more dangerous and difficult to cure. Dacre forefronts her poems with the protagonist's experience in her symptoms, prioritizing the physical reality of pain over memorialization of the actions that lead to them. Sonnet to Lara, a poem in both Hours of Solitude and an earlier collection Dacre wrote with her sister, Trifles of Helicon, asks questions grounded in symptoms. Why frequent wanders in the dead of night, the pensive Lara weeping sad alone? The speaker asks Lara why she leaves her bed and why she doesn't smile or speak until finally naming her malady. Is it melancholy sways the mind? By identifying Laura's strange actions and physical changes in a systematic, almost diagnostic medical context, Dacre emphasizes the severity of this ailment, thereby legitimizing suffering otherwise discounted as mere imagination or female weakness. That pain is not a plot point, it is the plot. Overwhelmed with pervasive melancholic pain, Dacre's protagonists crave the numbness of the grave as an anesthesia, not the anesthesia of the 1840s, but the defective loss of feeling caused by injury, illness, and other conditions typically deemed undesirable. In The Unfaithful Lover, the speaker anticipates the numbness of death. Seduction from those eyes no more, my conscious nerves will feel, and while your sorrows I deplore, I have no wish to heal. Gothic death presents the literary possibility of painlessness when other practical medical cures are insufficient or unavailable. Both Bienville and Buchan then stress that nymphomania and melancholy impact the physical health of the body. As Dacre's poetry shows, extreme states of mind can be felt in the chest, stomach, heart, and muscles. This illustrates Scottish physician Robert White's theory of the sentient principle and the sympathetic body, according to which the soul is directly connected to every part of the body, sentient and communicating among them through the nervous system. His early theory claims that no sooner are certain ideas presented in the mind than the motion of the heart is increased and accelerated. Thus, the body directly depends on the mind and is reflective of its activity and health. So let's look at how death imagined as a skeleton, is uniquely situated to address this physical pain. In the poetic dialogue between two title characters, Death and the Lady, the skeletal figure of Death appears to the lady suffering from melancholic pain. The poem repeats references to opening curtains, disrobing, and other acts of exposure, exposing not the female body, but the empty skeleton. Death deliberately exposes each clean rib, two empty eye sockets, and misty, the space between, that accelerates the absence of organs, muscles, nerve, and tissue. Death quite prominently displays a medically impossible, but Gothically possible emptiness, now attractive to a body full of pain. In the poem The Skeleton Priest or the Marriage of Death, Irene goes searching for her lover, Orlando, in anticipation of their approaching marriage. When Orlando finally appears, but the arms of Orlando than ice were more cold, as in them Irene he seemed to enfold. His futures were hid from her view. His voice seemed hollow, he mournfully sighed, a chilling despondence crept over the bride, a mistrust she dared not pursue. Irene, whose melancholy over the loss of her lover lasts only moments compared to other protagonists, physically changes to match the body of death to which she is drawn. Already she becomes cold and unable to feel physically or emotionally as she begins the process of anesthetization. She soon becomes a heart-frozen maid. The dead Orlando becomes conflated with the skeleton priest who disrobes, as he does in Death and the Lady, to expose his emptiness. As he takes her away, the anesthesia advances. The numbness of death slowly crept round her heart and palsied her nerves seemed to shrink. But why is the skeleton necessary? Wouldn't any form of death result in a cold state of unfeeling? According to romantic medicine, not necessarily. The Scottish physician John Brown, influenced by White's theory of the sympathetic body, argues that the nervous system worked under a simple system of excitability. Every living creature contains only so much excitability, and treatments should come in the form of either under or over stimulation. The influence of the Brownian paradigm, as this was called, can be seen in developing ideas about anesthesia. The reasons for hesitancy to pursue a controlled, chemically induced loss of feeling lay with this equation of life with consciousness or excitability. A body that lived but could not feel was a concept that made physicians and surgeons uneasy because it seemed to them too much like death. So the skeleton visually represents what medical theory worried about, that anesthesia could cause death or was itself a death-like state. But there's more. Why do these skeletons repeatedly make a show of revealing their empty exterior, so empty that mist and breezes blow right through them? Because it's important that they are empty. That the skeleton appears to Dacre's protagonists as empty speaks to medical anxieties and uncertainties about sensibility remaining in the body after death. As Brown theorized, the body without sensation was a body without life, implying that the dead would feel nothing. However, inconclusive experiments in the 18th century suggested that even a dead body may have lingering signs of life. These experiments showed that even in death, the internal organs might feel pain. This idea came from observing the continued motion of animal parts. In these experiments, organs reacted to external stimuli in what looked like pain, while some explained that, well, these movements in dead animal muscle, that's just an automatic reaction. White disagreed. He interpreted reactions to stimuli as indicative that the soul remained connected and that which reacts to stimuli is, by definition, neither more nor less than feeling. In other words, the reaction of the heart when poked was indicative of pain. White worried that the disembodied organs might indicate suffering beyond death. With the potential for pain to live on in parts of the dead body, Dacre's Gothic Death adopts a particular anatomy to ensure that this danger is avoided, the empty form of the skeleton. In going to this extreme, Dacre illustrates a need for more options to manage pain, not during surgery, but during more common experiences like melancholy. To return to Death and the Lady, the extremity of the solution offered by death meets the extremity of the lady's situation, centralizing her experience, legitimizing her pain, and freeing her from dependence on others and on her own failing body. At no point does she return to the lover who abandoned her or seek a new one. Especially in the context of medical texts about melancholy, this choice is a movement toward women's agency, not away from it. The death she will experience will leave her body empty and her pain alleviated. In the last lines, death unburdens her from her physical suffering anatomy. Then rising from her silken bed, she gave her hand to death. His touch benumbed her soul with dread and stopped her rising breath. This option unbinds the sufferer from the restrictions of a body that can feel, linking her with an unconventional treatment of Gothic anesthesia made possible by the empty skeleton. Finally, though Irene may think of her journey towards marriage in The Skeleton Priest as distinct, though the woman with the skull who joins her on her path disrupts this assumption. She says to herself and to Irene that she has taken this journey before, universalizing the experience of domestic pressures and their consequences. The woman with the skull says to Irene, "My road is the same as your own." And she adds, "'Tis gloomy to wander alone," creating a bond in their shared melancholy. In several ways, then, Dacre's connections between women, melancholy, pain, and death within the context of the Gothic imagination speaks to the emotional embodiment involved in expectations of marriage as an institution and medical understandings of gendered illness as part of that same institution. This is not an individual experience, but a shared one. Acknowledging the importance of material embodiments in women's experiences is at the core of Dacre's work, as is her subversion of medicine's insufficiency and its tendency to pathologize women's pain and emotions. In an age before medicine embraced anesthesia as positive, Dacre draws on an existing negative model of anesthesia to call attention to the painful embodied experiences of domestic disappointment her protagonists face. She thereby takes victimization of her suffering protagonists and turns it into a moment of rebellion and agency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Another really amazing paper. It's great to see Dacre getting some love, and yeah, that was a real treat. Thank you. So our final speaker today is Franz Potter. Franz J. Potter is a professor at National University and the program director of the MA in English Gothic Studies specialization. He's a specialist in 19th century Gothic chapbooks and has written extensively on the trade Gothic, the Gothic publishing industry, and the author Sarah Wilkinson. In 2010, he established studies in Gothic fiction and continues to serve on that journal's board. His book, The History of Gothic Publishing, 1800 to 1835, Exhuming the Trade, was published by Palgrave in 2005, and his new book, Gothic Chapbooks, Blue Books and Shilling Shockers, was published in January 2021 by the University of Wales Press. His paper today is entitled A Very Delicate State of Health, The Diseased Body in Sarah Wilkinson's Gothic Chapbooks.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen here and get this going. All right. I've actually had to slightly alter my title in progress. So it is now The Very Delicate State of Health, Sarah Wilkinson and the Diseased Body. So it kind of reflects just my research into Sarah Wilkinson and what she wrote. So in 1819, in a letter to the Royal Literary Fund, Gothic novelist Sarah Wilkinson lamented that, quote, authorship is so precarious a way of life that I have long since been disgusted with it and wish to be fully employed. Wilkinson had just accepted a teaching position at the National School at Bray, Maidenhead. After 16 years, 7 novels, and nearly 100 chapbooks and pamphlets, she wrote that she was ready to be, quote, placed above the evils of poverty and the precarious misery of authorship. Regrettably, after 9 months, she was forced most reluctantly to resign on account of the rapid decline of her health, quote, joined to the dreadful circumstance of a cancer breaking forth under her right arm, which, though not broke, gives her excruciating pain at intervals and adds to her weakening frame and prevents her industrious efforts to obtain a living for herself and fatherless child, end quote. Wilkinson's third-person narrative of her own tragic turn of fortune is telling, not only regarding the constant anxieties and uncertainties from living by the pen, but it underscores the precarious and often complicated and tenuous relationship between the healthy and the diseased body. I think it's quite fascinating that she decides, out of all of the letters to the Royal Literary Fund, this is the only one in third person. The entire letter is that way because she is just, it's almost blankly stating the fact that she had to leave and that she has developed cancer. Sarah Wilkinson was born to Hannah and William Wilkinson in St. Margaret's Parish in Westminster on 14 December 1779. We know very little about her childhood, but it's clear that she received an education and probably at one of the many day schools in Westminster. As a youth, she was selected by Lady Sophia Fielding to read to Lady Charlotte Finch, the retired royal governess at St. James Palace. It was under their patronage that she picked up the pen. Wilkinson first entered the literary marketplace, publishing 6 Gothic chapbooks with 3 different firms in 1803. While providing a number of publishers, including Simon Fisher, Benjamin Mason, and Thomas Hughes, original tales of terror, she began working closely with Anne Lemoyne. Over the next 3 years, Wilkinson published some 23 titles, which appeared in several collections and series that Lemoyne had initiated, including the Telltale magazine and Popular Tales, Lives, and Adventures. Wilkinson's early tales were primarily original romances, which utilized the same well-known, if not well-worn, Gothic motifs and tropes and were distinctly didactic in nature. It is within some of these early Gothic chapbooks that we can first detect Wilkinson's complicated approach to the healthy and diseased bodies. In Priory St. Clair, or Spectre of the Murdered Nun in 1811, the unfortunate Juliette de Roche is immured against her will by her father, but not before Louis Chabot, Count de Valve, lays eyes upon her. At once enraptured, he plots not only to declare his love, but to rescue her from the clutches of the church. His letters are met with contempt and coldness, which in typical Gothic fashion only increases the Count's desire to possess the fair nun. After all, the Count, as described by Wilkinson, is one who, quote, loves the fair sex, but not in the manner they deserve to be loved, for he regarded them merely as lovely beings created for no other purpose than to soothe the cares of men, attend on them, and administer to their sensual pleasures. In short, his opinion in this point bordered on those professed to be followers of Muhammad's creed that women had no souls. He soon discovers that Juliet is dangerously ill, and, quote, in great dejection of spirits, and medicines had been ordered for her to take 4 times a day, end quote. He similarly diagnoses Juliet's low spirits and indisposition as a lovesick rather than diseased body, which flattered the Count. Quote, she loves me, he said, but her lofty sentiment and bigotry will not let her own it. Yet when I have her in my arms, she will see that there is no difficulty or danger but that which can be contended to hazard for her sake. She will renounce this frigid conduct and kindly yield to my endearing argument. As Juliet becomes more languid and physically ill, those around her, including the austere prioress, refuse to see the illness for what it is and instead accuse her, quote, of feigning to be worse than she really was, that she might not perform the pious duties of her situation, end quote. Where the prioress and other nuns should be compassionate, they are dismissive and cruel in their suspicions. Eventually, Julieta succumbs to her illness and is administered medicine, which the Count has replaced with a sleeping draught, which, quote, would cause a death-like sleep for 8 and 40 hours. The pulse would not seem to be so slow would it be its motion, and the whole form would have the hue and appearance of a corpse. End quote. Placed in a coffin, secreted out of the convent, and imprisoned in the deserted wing of the Count's castle, Juliet's illness is genuine and exacerbated by her immurement and separation from her true lover. Unwilling to acknowledge her illness or her cure or cure it, the Count threatens to kill her if she does not become his mistress. Rather than stay with the Count, Julieta attempts to flee her prison only to be murdered. Several things are interesting about this episode. First, de Valve uses illness as a pretext for the exploitation and eventual murder of Julieta. Second, disease and illness does not evoke sympathy from those around the sufferer. Not only does the priory fail to empathize with the suffering novice, the Count views illness merely as a means to an end. Illness then inevitably results in confinement, a separation, and the eventual death of the sufferer. These early Wilkinson Gothic chapbook narratives also focus on the vulnerability of the female body, which of course includes the disease and illness. Similar to the external physical threats to the body, Wilkinson views illness as inherently a violent assault. In The White Cottage of the Valley, for example, Miss Louvain was attacked by a serious indisposition, the violent effects which operating on her frame long since weakened by age and infirmities. Likewise, in The Subterraneous Passage, Wilkinson describes a violent fever, a violent illness, a violent fit illness, and violent convulsions, all of which render the bodies of even the most virtuous, damaged, and imprisoned in their own bodies. What is particular interest here is the way in which Wilkinson not only employs but represents disease and illness in her own narrative. Wilkinson tends to take a didactic approach to the Gothic, utilizing it as a means to instruct, warn, and safeguard vulnerable young women from the terrors and dread frequently associated with domesticity, courtship, and even marriage. In female Gothic, domesticity rarely offers a safe or secure space. More often than not, the female body is a contested space, replete with potentially deadly threats, both emotional and physical. Young women in these spaces were frequently subjected to the machinations of fathers, husbands, and other interlopers who would invade the home or body. Interestingly, Wilkinson's depiction of illness further destabilizes the domestic space, reinforcing the sense of vulnerability that exists in the female Gothic. In 1818, Wilkinson began writing to the Royal Literary Fund for financial assistance. Her first letter is missing, but it talks about how, or the notes in the letter say that she is a virtuous woman who has had some terrible times, so they gave her £5. And then the other letters, of course, build on this. The letters reveal a complexity and perils of female authorship and are an important source of the essential biographical information. Moreover, they provide insight into Wilkinson's own Gothic body, corpus and corporeal, which function as a location of both horror and suffering. I forgot to do some of these. So there's and now I'll just catch up. Okay, so now these are going to be a bunch of quotes, so read them as you want, but I'll try to remember to do this. Wilkins's earliest letters to the Royal Literary Fund are desperate and oddly optimistic. Wilkinson viewed education as the best means to self-sufficiency and authorship as wholly unsustainable. The job offer, brokered by Mrs. Lovell, the headmistress of the Whitechapel Free School to the school in Bray, had a very, quote, good salary, coach, a house to live in, and my child to be with me and expect to be sent for with every prospect of being comfortable for life. Regrettably, Wilkinson's teaching career was short-lived, and she returned to Westminster, settling at number 4 Winchester Row near Vincent Square. There, she opened up a small parlor where she sold thread, tapes, pins, along with books and pictures for children, and once again engaged in the library business. In 1806, when she sold her first novel by subscription, she opened up a circulating library with the proceeds and established herself with her daughter. Despite the detached letter regarding her cancer in 1820, Wilkinson continued to identify as an author, though one starting to see the effects of illness and disease edge into her life. By 1821, she was increasingly ill and suffering from what she termed a severe attack and was unable to leave her room or work. In a letter dated December 12, 1821, she assures the committee that all the industry I can do, I have tried, but I am of that sex where earning at the best of times are comparatively small, and a weak state of health joined to a painful tumor under my right arm renders me incapable of my exertion beyond my pen and needlework. Despite a real need for support, the committee frequently declines to assist her. Wilkinson's letters were beginning to rely, though, on an illness narrative as a means to solicit the needed assistance. She was in a situation where the window broke in her in her room, and she was unable to pay for it. She was going to be taken before the courts, and she expected to be dragged off any moment. She wrote to the Royal Literary Fund and asked them for help. They denied her. She wrote again. They denied her. And finally, her daughter, Amelia Scadgel, subtly subverts her mother's narrative by claiming that, quote, that the indisposition or the illness continues more for the want of proper necessities than from illness, in consequence of the depression of spirits on account of the melancholy prospect in which she is placed. And with this, the committee approved the request for assistance. The reluctance of the Royal Literary Fund to provide immediate relief further underscores the difficulties Wilkinson faced living by the pen, particularly with a chronic or terminal illness. Increasingly, Wilkinson began to embody her own suffering Gothic heroine, confined or imprisoned by illness and poverty. Quote, incapacitated by ill health and a tumor in my right breast from undertaking any situation, Wilkinson wrote in December 1822, she had experienced, quote, repeated confinement from illness during the last 12 months and has not only rendered my poverty more severe, but compelled me to part with my wearing apparel. Also expect every hour my few remaining goods to be seized for arrears of rent, unavoidably contracted. In 1824, Wilkinson underwent an operation at the Westminster Hospital and, unable to work, promised that if she should recover, quote, I shall turn my attentions to some other mode of obtaining my living other than the precarious one of the pen. She wrote that, quote, the tumor in my breast, which I have formerly stated as one of the causes that rendered me incapable of seeking another situation, and for which I have sought various advice and remedies, till I was led to the false hope that its progress was stayed. But now I am assumed a cancer, but it has now assumed a cancerous appearance, attended with the most excruciating pain, which joined to anticipation as the probable result, gives me both corporeal and mental agony. Increasingly, Wilkinson struggles with her diseased body, which gives rise to more uncertainties and anxieties. Wilkinson's recovery was protracted, and she obtained little work for the following year. She wrote to the Royal Literary Fund as her health continued to decline, declaring that, quote, for some months past, I have been in a regular decline, my weakness daily increasing, my recovery hopeless. She was offered some medical advice stating that my only chance is pure air, non-working diet, occasional medicine. Of this I cannot avail myself of no substance, subsistence, but what I derive from my little employment afforded me. In these later letters, Wilkinson seems to embrace her diseased body as a means for support, though actual empathy, as with her Gothic heroines, is fleeting. In 1826, Wilkinson's cancer returned. She informed the Royal Literary Fund that she, quote, went into a situation in the country, but the cancer in my breast impelled me to resign it. Upon returning to London, she became an outpatient at St. George Hospital, and I'm totally behind there again. This is the Westminster Hospital, St. George Hospital. And underwent 2 additional incisions, but that only exacerbated the cancer, and, quote, a decisive operation has become absolutely necessary, end quote. In one of Wilkinson's most desperate letters, she writes, I entrust your humane attention to the particular sufferings that have long clouded my hapless destiny, and which it is more than probable will, without a merciful God deems it fit to ordain otherwise, soon terminate my existence. I have no one to answer for my burial, no sum to deposit in lieu thereof, which would be returned upon my discharge, no one to support me there with indispensable necessities of wanting, etc. And few things poverty has spared me is detained for arrears of rent unavoidably contracted. But the whole of my wants, a small comparative sum would remain to relieve an almost broken heart. Here it is. Wilkinson perhaps seems to start to own the narrative of her diseased body. And on Thursday, the 28th of December, 1826, Wilkinson undergoes her divisive surgery at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And if it's anything like the mastectomies that Fanny Burney, of course, experienced, it was a quite the horrific event. Nothing, though, is heard from Wilkinson again until January 8th of 1828. She has found new lodgings at number 9 Jeffreys Building, Great Almery, a tenement in the slums of Westminster, just west of the workhouse. Increasingly ill and confined to her lowly apartment, she admits that, quote, I have no source of substance whatsoever but the very precarious one of the now humble efforts of my pen, though I aver my inclinations are for otherwise, but personal affliction amongst is a cancer in my right breast prevents me from it, often confining me to my lowly apartment for weeks together. I have been a patient of St. George, Westminster, and Bartholomew's Hospital, have undergone several incisions, one of the serious nature with only temporary benefit. In my depressed, destitute situation, I trust ensure me that pity which I appeal. A prisoner of her own diseased body, Wilkinson still attempts to live by the pen. However, by 1830, she is writing very little, and a severe winter compounded her poverty, impacted her health, and the last letter the committee received was written on April 12th, 1830, to thank them for the £5 donation, which paid for her overdue past rent. Less than a year later, Wilkinson moved into St. Margaret's workhouse, where she passed away on the 19th of March, 1831. And the yellow bit of the map above is where the Jeffreys building was. So she was living in these slums right next to the workhouse, and we can see how she just gradually made her way there. But overall, when we look at Sarah Wilkinson, we look at, I think we need to look at both her physical body and the body of her work to really gain an understanding about the uncertainties and anxieties that existed with particularly female authors who lived by the pen and who suffered immensely for their art. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating and tragic. Yes, thank you.
Depressing, I know.
So yeah, and lots of virtual applause coming in, and lots of thanks in the chat. I'm going to open things up now for questions. There were a few coming in the chat as I look back and find those. Just to say first as well, while I have the chance, that open for booking soon is our next event, which is on the 28th of February. And that's a special event for postgraduate students and early career researchers. It's a workshop curated and led by our Gothic Women Associate, Beth Brigham, who's from Northumbria. And it's an event entitled The Gothic Women Writers of Minerva Press. So it's seeking to unearth the hidden and marginalized voices of Minerva's Gothic women writers, examining Minerva Press's place within Romantic studies, and most importantly, raising the question, why reclaim the Gothic fiction of the Minerva Press now? So the event is free. It's for postgraduate students and early career researchers. Special event for them. We'll have a public event back in March on Queer Gothic. So the booking page for those future events will be shared on our website and social media very soon. So please do look out for those. So the questions that have come in so far, I will just look back and find them. So yes, in the order they came in, this is a question for Lucy first. Yes. A question saying that you reminded the questioner of Anne Bronte's The Tenant, in which Arthur was killed by a horse. He was a gambling addict and alcoholic, indulging in excess. Might there have been some influences at work there?
I don't know. I'm sorry, that's the end of my answer. I don't know. I mean, I'm starting to move more into the 19th century, but I'm really an 18th centuryist / romanticist. So what the Brontes were up to is of mild interest to me. But yeah, I don't go that far. I mean, Edgeworth was widely read, so there's no reason that there mightn't have been some connection, but I don't know how read the popular tales, surprisingly, were. I haven't seen much on the lottery, certainly, and it's the first one in the book and the longest. So, I mean, it's possible, but it wasn't one of her most widely read works. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, another question from Sharanash. Edgeworth's description of addiction sounds very personal and lived. Did you have a close friend or family member that was an alcoholic?
I want to know this too. No, as far as I can tell, no. But it was just rampant in Ireland at the time. You know, there would have been stories, there certainly were stories. Her father had a cousin who went to drink and died. I mean, but did she experience that personally? I feel like there's a real person behind Mrs. Dolly, because a lot of her most acute portraits are of real people, or draw on real people's experience. And a former laundress from Derby feels like a little angry little woman given to drink. If she feels very real, but I don't know, and I haven't found anything in the letters. I mean, I could do another troll, I suppose, and see if I can find anything. But I would speculate yes, but don't know any more than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Right, for Laura, so yes, from Dale Townsend. Great paper. So he has one question. In poems such as The Skeleton Priest and Death and the Lady, the text is, I think, Burger's Lenore, possibly even as filtered through the poems of Matthew Lewis in The Monk and elsewhere. Do you think there's a specifically literary subtext here that is just as interesting as the medical one? Any thoughts on Dacre's use of Lenore? It's one of those ballads that draws Dacre and Matthew Lewis so closely together.
Yeah, I would completely agree, Dale. It's been a while since I've read Lenore, but I know that Lewis drew from it all the time, and Dacre was constantly influenced by Lewis. So I know that there are threads there, and I know that there are, subtexts there as well. I don't have a ready answer for that. I don't know what those subtexts would be, but I know that the connections are there, undoubtedly.
I should say as well, with the people whose questions have come in when I'm reading out your things, feel free to unmute and come in yourself. And also, if people have questions, you can do as Laura has done and raise your hand, and I will come to you down the list as well, because it's always nice to hear from people in person as well as in the chat. So yes, another question for you, Laura. Did Dacre ever refer to laudanum or other drugs to anesthetize a body suffering from melancholy?
That is a great question. I can't remember any references to specific medications. Part of the larger chapter that this comes from, I do talk about her novel, The Passions, which is a novel that includes both someone suffering from nymphomania, but then also someone suffering from melancholy. And it's kind of a failed attempt to cure both of those illnesses. There's no supernatural in them at all. There's no kind of Gothic attempt to adapt medicine into, a way of curing those characters. And I can't remember any mention of any specific medications used in that novel either. There's a fleeting mention of ether in Hours of Solitude, although the obvious meaning of it is, in the ether. But there's a secondary meaning kind of underlying it as well. But I can't remember any specific mention of laudanum, even though that was something that was used for pain frequently.
Thank you. Yes, so a question for Franz then. And actually this is something that I was kind of wondering as well, so I'm going to ask the question and then build on it slightly if you don't mind. Did Wilkinson's writing during her illness reflect her experience? So yeah, what I was wondering about this was whether there's a kind of terror of external forces invading, switching into a terror of internal, or yes, is there a reflection of what's happening to her in the writing?
Well, that's a great question, and something that I'm working on. We do notice that her early work, when she was before her cancer, was a lot of original tales, and after 1820, she mostly does adaptations and abridgments. Very few original tales, but she does do some. I do see a link, though, between her health and her experience, what she's going through, even in location-wise, in the novel The Spectre of Landmere Abbey. She uses the same locations that she's living in. She talks about the same roads, the hospitals in the area, and an experience of a young single woman living in London with a child. And it's obvious that it is reflective of her. And throughout the novel, it does kind of change where she's coming to terms. She's an angry character, Mary of Landmere, and she develops and she grows and she has to overcome a lot of the anger and a lot of physical issues during this novel as she gets in contact with her family again. But there is some, I think there is some autobiographical things going on within other tales too. There's a gambling work that she published in 1825, I believe, Oaken Hall, something like that. But it was based on the Westminster Pit, which was just a cockfighting arena that was right down the street from her. So I see there's, she is taking a lot of her own experiences and putting them into her work, but not a lot of original material after that. She really just is rehashing the exact same thing she did before.
Wow. Yeah. Right. I see we have a couple of in-person questions. I think there's one more from the chat that I'll go to, which is for Laura, but Lucy might want to come in as well because it's Blakey. So yes. So Laura, you were speaking about the idea that even in death, the internal organs may feel pain. Can this apply to Blake, Horizon Plate 7, when a skeleton is shown as in deep pain?
I don't have that image fresh in my mind. If it is just a skeleton, my understanding is that it was mostly the organs that were thought to feel this pain.
Hello. Hello.
Do go ahead.
That was my question. Yes. Thank you very much for the talk. And sorry. Yes. I have the picture. May I share my screen for one moment?
We don't allow screen sharing. Sorry. You can, if you like, email it to
anyway, I know the image you're talking about.
Lucy, go for it.
And I actually wrote an essay about Blake and anatomy, and that image comes up in it. So he presents, or at least my argument was that he presents Horizon in the Book of Horizon as being born through a process of reverse anatomization, because he's born as a skeleton and then grows organs. So in that case, yes, that skeleton could be described as feeling pain, but it's like it's it's a fantastical image and a fantastical kind of setting and a kind of imaginative engagement, but it reflects Blake's horror at it reflects Blake's horror at anatomy and the processes involved with it, and the kind of dehumanization of the person involved, which he saw as a kind of violence against the person, the self. And if you're interested, the connection with Jack Hunter is worth following up, who was so, the kind of incredible appetite he had for anatomy, the kind of strange energy involved in that, it comes through in Blake's approach to the skeleton and the kind of anatomized body. So I would say yes, potentially at least, but it's in Blake's own weirdo way. So
yeah, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Laura, you've been waiting super patiently. Sorry, and thank you.
That's okay. It was just, I'm going right back to the question at the start that was asked of Lucy about the connections potentially with Arthur and Tennant. And because the thing that I thought of immediately when I saw that question great question though it was that he's a man. And I was wondering about the extent to which it's significant that Dolly's a woman, and the degree to which there is something extra monstrous in Edgeworth's writing, perhaps, or in writing of the period about a female drunkard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the case. Like I've been writing about Edgeworth and alcohol, like I've written a longer thing about it, and covered representations of male drunkards in Castle Rackrent and various other texts. And there's an extra viciousness in Dolly as a person. She's more monstrous. The rest of them are sad, like they're sad and broken and useless, but she's monstrous. And it does seem to be like Edgeworth is particularly hard on women who can't control themselves.
That's what it made me think. It made me think of self-control. It made me think of that, the idea that there's something particularly unfeminine about lack of self-control.
Yeah, I mean, and like I would link it to kind of conduct literature and that kind of, Savile and so on, talking quite openly about the double standards that women are subject to. We can do as we like, but if you do it, you will be judged. And like Dolly just doesn't care. And there's something, it's weird because she's such a vibrant character. Like she just completely takes over that story. There's a thing in Edgeworth where the characters she hates the most, nonetheless, are clearly the most fascinating to her. She's not really interested in any of the others. Like even good old Ellen, who's always there, no, don't do that. Gets hardly any development. It's all Dolly. So I don't know, like I think it's a really personal repugnance, like genuine revulsion at someone like Dolly, and particularly because she's a woman. And that's the stepping out. And I think it's significant. I mean, she's not just said, she's not a mother. There's no suggestion of that, but that her behavior towards the child, seems to really hit on those, the negative image of the woman who, doesn't know how to care for a child. More than that, puts a child in danger, corrupts the child.
Yeah, it's that classic sense of unnatural monstrosity that's so connected with lack of maternity in the period.
Yeah, I mean, she's kind of unsexed. She's got a loud voice. She's always trying to get men to do what she wants. There's nothing really feminine about her at all. So it seems to like hit all those, particular notes, I guess. But yeah, I think very much so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to come in with a question? You're welcome to, if I've missed something in the chat, you're welcome to repost it, post a new question, or raise your hand to ask a question of any of our speakers. And in the meantime, kind of as people are thinking, I might just invite our speakers to think about or to reflect on connections between the papers. I mean, I was thinking with Franz and Laura about the idea of women's pain not being taken seriously, or the need for women's pain to be taken more seriously. Might you say more about that?
Yeah, I think in the case of Sarah Wilkinson, I think that there's a lot of pain in all of her work, and that if we look at, I think we need to look at her work in context of her life, because let's be honest, her work is not that great. I mean, this is not high standard, but she clearly spent her entire life trying to support herself with a pen, and even when she hated it. And she's expressing over and over again that she hates this precarious life. I mean, there's such pain there when she's saying this. And you can just feel, I mean, it's visceral, her pain and the desire to get away from it. But she's still only left with that. And there's other parts in the letters where she says she's trying, her needlework. In other parts of the letter, she says, she's terrible at needlework. This is the only thing that she can do, and she doesn't like it, but she'll go through it because she needs to support herself and her daughter. So I think that pain aspect is really important to consider, especially when somebody is not an Anne Radcliffe or even a Charlotte Docker. I mean, she's not that same level, but she is out there. So.
And what I thought was so interesting in what you were saying, Franz, is how often she asked for help. And in a narrative medicine standpoint, she was always looking for the right way to express what she was suffering, kind of those magic words to actually get someone to help her. Like there was a certain way. It wasn't enough to just feel the pain. It wasn't just enough to express the pain. She had to find a particular magical way to express that pain so that someone would react to it. So many layers of just that experience. It was so interesting how you described that.
Well, we take the letter, we take these letters with a grain of salt. We know that they're writing to get help. I mean, and all of them sound pathetic. But I think there is a genuineness to her pleas, because she is not getting the support. I mean, if she receives so little compared to most men who ask for help. I mean, it's astonishing. And when she really, really needed it, there would be the replies of, we don't see anything, here. There's no need. Even though she's facing imprisonment or she's facing starvation, they'll look at her and say, no. It's astonishingly brutal.
There's a couple of questions coming in the chat. Sharon, I might call on you actually to say a little bit more about this. Sharon Dempsey is saying, I can see connections with my work examining representations of the female body in crime fiction. Are you willing to unmute and say a little bit more?
See, that's it. No, do you want to come back to me?
I will. Yeah, of course. So a question coming in from Berlana, saying, Wollstonecraft writes extensively about giving brandy to infants who, in her mind, should only have breast milk, infants in the early postpartum period. Is it clear whether Edgeworth had a stance on this?
Am I unmuted? I am. I don't know. She doesn't express that much interest in babies. But George is quite a young child and Dolly is forcing drink on him, so I would assume she would be very against it. She is, like, as I say, she said, like, she read Erasmus Darwin, who was pretty anti-alcohol, and made him more anti-alcohol in her kind of summing up of his argument. She does occasionally, in letters and things, describe herself as having a drink or two, but she's generally disgusted by it. And she's particularly concerned in the lottery about the effects on children. One of the anecdotes that she repeats that her father told her of an example his mother gave him, there we go, is of a young man who is kind of already ruined at 18 from excessive drinking. So she's really kind of out of step with the time. Like she's almost, I mean, she's not teetotal, but she's really anti-drink at a point when, like, the temperance movement isn't really going yet or anything. It's really extreme. So she would hate it. I don't know if she says anything about it. I've never come across her saying anything about it explicitly, but I would be pretty confident she would hate it.
There's an interesting continuation of that kind of trickle down effect from her aping her betters and then kind of foisting it onto the child, that sort of sense of infection almost.
Yeah, like Edgeworth really thinks of bad behavior in that sense. It's almost like a hygiene question. You know, like she's so kind of Victorian in her thinking. It's weird that she's ahead of that because like she's very concerned with like the shaping. It's not just like a kind of Rousseauvian or whatever idea of being shaped, or like Lockean idea of being shaped in childhood. It's more than that. It's like that you, as you say, you can be like almost infected with bad habits that can't be shifted then. And she cites various philosophers, but she seems to have had her own particular perspective on this, which is stronger and, as I say, more about kind of almost social hygiene as an idea. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Sharon, would you like us to come back?
Right.
As Laura was saying, that was
Thank you very
appropriately
much.
Gothic sound effects last time.
No, sorry. No, I was just saying I could see a lot of connections and overlaps with my own research, which I'm looking at the female body being read as a crime scene. So I'm really looking at modern day crime fiction, but I'm very interested in the idea of this entrenchment in corporeality, which has almost given rise to this idea of patriarchal privileges. And I see that with what Franz was saying about the diseased body, you know, that the female is more corporeal, is more burdensome because of the body, as opposed to the male mind, which, you know, has been so entrenched in literature and thinking. So just, you know, wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, does anyone want to come back on that? Any of our speakers?
Well, I would agree. I think that it is really interesting, the effect of the female body, of the female diseased body versus the diseased male. In Wilkinson's work, the diseased male always, if he's evil, he lingers in his illness until the end. But if he's a good person and he happens to die, it's always a quick and natural death. There's no pain or it's not drawn out. With the females, though, they tend to all suffer some sort of pain throughout their lives, and they either end up with, you know, getting married and being happy theoretically, or they end up with being bitter and in pain, really, for the rest of their lives for choices they made.
Thank you. So yes, now we are coming to the end, but if anyone has any final questions, this is kind of last chance to ask something. So yeah, feel free to put your hand up or pop it in the chat. If not, Laura, do you mind if I ask you to say a little bit about Dacre's relationship to other female poets in the period, like how you would see this comparing to Smith on melancholy or Yearsley on indifference? You know, how she fits into that picture.
So I do, in the rest of the chapter, I talk about Anne Homehunter, who was John Hunter's wife and was herself a poet. And so I talk a lot about their relationship and the way that they are both using ideas about anesthesia, early ideas about anesthesia, to talk about melancholy. So she's not the only one who's doing it. And all these writers are kind of looking at the idea of oblivion, the idea of feeling, not maybe as much as the physicality of it as Dacre is, but that desire to numb that feeling in some way or another. They're not using the Gothic element as strongly, I would say, as Dacre does, but there's certainly, I think, some ties. I mean, I think one thing that I would like to argue is that she is trying to make those connections with other women. She's kind of read by some as anti-feminist, which I don't agree with in any way. And so I think that she is trying to make those connections with other women and try to make melancholy and the passions associated with it a little bit more universal as a female experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Laura.
Hi, I've a slightly poorly formed question for Laura, but it just, when you were talking about the kind of embrace of death as a way of kind of almost legitimating the woman's suffering and therefore escaping it, it made me think strangely of Francis Greville's A Prayer for Indifference as being a different response to that, a kind of mid 18th century response to excessive feeling, where she's this poem where she's kind of praying to the fairies to take her feelings, to bring the nymph indifference. So she kind of accepts that she won't feel the extremes of joy that she feels, but she won't feel the extremes of sorrow, that she'd kind of rather have this numbness, that's kind of preferable to the intense suffering that she's experiencing through being a kind of person of extreme sensibility or melancholia, if you like. And I'm just interested in the shift that seems to happen in the Gothic genre with someone like Dacre, who instead of praying for indifference is fantasizing about an extreme embrace of the feeling. And I also kind of related to that, kind of wondered about the extent to which it can help us think about the connections between the psycho and somatic aspects of depression, the degree to which, in a way, she's saying, you know, there's a somatic element to this, but that doesn't negate the psychological suffering. It in fact confirms it. It reaffirms the suffering that she's experiencing. Does any of that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about, I mean, the only difference between asking for fairies for oblivion, right, and for the you know, ability to not feel, is that suddenly we're breaking this anatomical structure that is itself human. So it's still dealing with the supernatural, but it's kind of dealing more with that very particular Gothic element of that skeleton, that she knew that her readers would know about. Like she knew that her readers would recognize, excuse me, skeletons as Gothic. So she's kind of drawing on that trope that already exists, and she's making it a lot more active, right? So usually skeletons are, you know, found in a trunk somewhere, some kind of indication that a crime has happened. These are completely different kinds of skeletons. They're active, they're doing something. And so her embracing them is that same desire for the inability to feel, the giving up of all the emotions, not just the sad ones, giving up joy, giving up happiness, all those things as well. And the last part about what you said, I think we still grapple with that today, right? I mean, we still grapple with getting people to understand that something like depression is a physical condition that affects people. It is real, and it's not just in your mind. So in many ways, things haven't really changed, and she is articulating a lot of the things that we are just articulating differently, maybe not even better today.
It is, I think that's a lovely kind of place to kind of sum up how thinking about Gothic bodies is kind of this opens up these experiences that we can like really kind of fundamentally, viscerally understand or connect to. And those were just 3 really wonderful papers tonight. So yeah, thank you all so much. That was just fascinating. So yeah, please join me, everybody, in a virtual round of applause. And thank you all for coming.